To let migrants in, to not let migrants in, that is the question. A lot has been happening across the topic of immigration in different countries across the globe, and it's such a complex topic that we decided we needed to talk about.
And if you haven't already, remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. Your support is what keeps us going. We also released the Rethinking Tech survey, which you can find in the show notes below. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, and we'll make Rethinking Tech better for you. Welcome back to the Rethinking Tech podcast. I'm Aparna.
And I'm Harinda,
Our podcast breaks the topic of tech apart.
covering the surprising connections to geopolitics, business, and ethics.
We're both humanitarians, and I'm a lawyer, currently freezing in Paris. Where did the summer go?
And I'm a former entrepreneur, globetrotter, and currently actually soaking wet because it's raining here in Italy.
I think it's an EU thing. Every week, we break down the hottest tech topics you need to know about. Today, we're going to start with some context to ground our discussion, explaining why immigration, an important topic always, but why it's especially important today. And we'll do so in 3 separate segments. First, we'll talk about the tech implications, then the geopolitics of it all, and finally, my favorite part, the ethical dilemmas behind it. Harinda, please provide some context. Immigration dates back thousands of years. So why are we still talking about it today?
Well, we're talking about it because people can't agree on what it means to have immigration within a specific country. There's typically 2 different sides to the debate. There's one side that says we need immigration talent. It helps on the innovation side. It builds the economy. Innovation then goes on to become a moneymaker for countries, helping the economy continue to grow. And then there's also an argument around the population crisis with low birth rates across many, many Western countries. There's also the humanitarian debate. There's a lot of people that are migrating away from their countries or escaping sometimes, given the local context. And so there's a lot of people saying we also need to do the humanitarian effort of letting a lot of the people in that are coming from troubled backgrounds. And then on the other side, there is the group of people that basically say we do not need immigration, at least not in the current format. A lot of the immigrants that are coming in are taking on the high paid jobs, and that leaves a lot of the local population essentially taking the mediocre or lower skilled wage jobs. And there's an accusation that's also floating around that immigrants are behind the wave of crime that's happening in many of the countries and that they cross the borders illegally. And then once they cross, they also claim benefits that are draining government coffers. Essentially, what they keep saying is, do they belong in the country? And even then, culturally, do they assimilate or do they actually just continue to hold their own cultures? And these 2 debates, for me, are on polar opposites. I think that one of the hardest things about this discussion is that in the last years, I have heard almost no discussions that walk the line in the middle, that there is no argumentation of how is it that we actually bridge the gap between these 2 extremes.
I grew up in Canada, a country that prides itself on immigration. So growing up, I was of the belief that immigration is necessary for nation building. But lately, especially over the last 5-6 years, it's being reframed as a wedge issue. In fact, make it 10 years. It's dividing countries, dividing the globe in terms of how people should be treating immigration. Instead of immigration strengthening society, it seems to be retracting from it. And the US, which is where a lot of our discussion typically takes place, once marked itself as a land of opportunity, but now, under its current administration, seems to be quite anti-immigrant. And I wonder, how has the meaning of immigration evolved from opportunity to controversy? When did that happen and why?
It's really hard to answer that question because one of the challenges is that across the centuries in which people have been moving in across borders, there have been colonies. With a lot of colonies, what's happened in today's day is that countries are now recompensating the people of nations that they have conquered in the past by being able to give them passports. And this is something that we're seeing in the Netherlands, we're seeing in France, we're seeing in so many other countries. And so this debate is really complicated because it's not a monodirectional one. It's actually one that keeps rolling in itself and becomes even more complex. I find it really hard to tease the difference of who is right and who is wrong, just because of these layers of history that challenge the way many of us have to perceive it. And so, what a lot of people are doing that I'm noticing, especially those that are in the camp of we want to close the borders and we want no more immigration, or we want to severely handicap immigration, they're basically just saying, this is the state of the country. Let's now start from zero. Let's close the borders and then let's rebuild the country from within. And I actually can understand that argumentation, given the fact that there are pretty serious accusations on the one side, but some pretty serious concerns from citizens of certain countries.
Feel like whenever we're talking about immigration these days, we're rarely thinking about it from the immigrant's perspective. We're thinking about it from a government perspective, from how much money is quote unquote being lost by giving it to foreigners. And we're thinking about it as the local citizen or resident reaction. But rarely do we think about it in terms of, are people feeling welcome? Why have they left their home country to come to a foreign country? Are there push factors, pull factors? And I'm wondering where that narrative got lost. And to be clear, when I'm talking about immigration, I'm not talking about those seeking refugee status. That's a whole other discussion. This is people who are going through the system, are legally applying for immigration status, and then choosing to leave their home, their families, their friends, their community, the languages that they have grown up with to enter a brand new environment. It could be because of oppression, environmental crises, poverty, but they're always doing it because they're looking for better opportunity. They're looking to add value to this new country, no?
One of the things is that there's this sort of gray and overlapping area between the two sides that you were describing. So you have the immigrants that are coming in through the legitimate means, and there's laws for this and there's pathways for it. And then on the other side, you have the refugee status that is also really not just contentious, but is really a complicated process to go through. And one of the reasons that it's so frustrating for so many people is because those two actually have a very thick line that actually overlaps on both sides. I have friends who in Italy, I've lived here 17 years off and on. And the law actually states that if you spend 10 years in full residence, you essentially are entitled to permanent residence, which could be the pathway to citizenship. But I never got it because I did 9 plus additional years afterwards. And the reason I mention this case is because my friends used to joke all the time saying, you know what, it would be so much easier if you just went across the water to Tunisia, Libya, or any of the North African countries, stayed in your, a fancy hotel for a few days, and then went to the beach and hopped on a boat. And the reason that they joke about that is because the pathway for citizenship for people that have become refugees or crossed over as refugees is so much easier than the legitimate pathway that has been established. And so there are these types of frustrations that sort of drag these two sides into the same debate, and it just becomes completely murky water.
That's a very fair point. That I'm not saying refugee status should not be used. If you need it, it should be used. But there's a lot of people who also exploit it. And I think because of that, we are now starting to see the wedge further divide people. But before we get into our geopolitical discussion, why don't we talk tech and why it's relevant? Why is tech impacted by immigration? How do the two collide at all? Well, the US tech sector has been a huge beneficiary of immigration policies. Many of its recipients are people who would not otherwise be able to work in the US. Not only do they receive an H-1B visa, they then go directly to Silicon Valley or to tech startups in the Bay Area and contribute their value there. So immigration has demonstrated that it is deeply tied to innovation. However, this past week, Donald Trump said that he was going to raise the fees for H-1B visas. Previously, you would apply for an H-1B visa, you'd get into a lottery system, you'd hope you get it, then there's additional legal fees, whatever. The fee that your company would pay for you would be $215. As of Sunday, this value has gone up to $100,000, which means that many companies are likely now going to hesitate. 70% of all H-1B recipients last year were from India. That's a huge number in terms of the H-1B visas they have, but also think about their families that they bring with them. And now a debate is arising as to, is the US shooting itself in the foot by making it that much harder to get an H-1B visa? Or is this the right thing to do going forward? What do you think?
I think that there's an underlying assumption that by creating a gap, they sort of abolish the H-1B or they sort of significantly hamper its progress, that it'll just create a gap that will be filled in with local talent. But the unfortunate part is that the talent that is required is actually not filling that gap. Now, I'm sure that a lot of the employers in the States and in many countries, they are actually using the H-1B and the justification of going abroad in terms of lowering their costs or not having to spend so much time, going through the US, candidates, etc. And there's probably a multitude of reasons that are both legitimate and illegitimate. But I think that that assumption is not necessarily correct or properly in check, that the entire population of the United States is able to fill that gap. And so then it still leaves this question of, okay, so what happens when companies need to hire fast? We're talking about capitalistic economies. So if you cannot hire fast, then what is your next alternative? There's another aspect that I was also thinking about when it comes to visas, which is in immigration right now, a lot of the different checks and balances in terms of all of the documents that you have to submit are now starting to include social media. And what are you saying on social media? Are you aligning your voice with that of the government, or are you actually against the current administration? And that's one of the things that we're seeing in the United States. And as a result, it's also a way of shifting immigration status towards bringing people that are aligned with the current government's agenda. And I think that's also a very significant aspect because H-1Bs are usually the sort of super talented, highly educated, experience awarded people. And so when you bring them, they bring opportunity. They are the ones that start companies. They are the ones that start projects and get funding. And when you try to filter that just for a specific geopolitical stance, you very likely are also murking the democratic waters in a sense.
And it's worth noting that there have been several prominent tech industry leaders who only entered the US on their H-1B visa. Elon Musk, Sundar Pichai, and Microsoft's Satya Nadella were all at one point H-1B visa holders. So as you said, these are very talented people that are now not going to be able to enter the market. I wonder whether this is, in the short term, fine, maybe going to employ more Americans, but in the long term, isn't this going to hurt America? Isn't this going to hurt innovation and entrepreneurship? Where are they going to get their talent? Talented people exist. Now they're just not going to all come and converge in Silicon Valley. They're going to stay in Delhi, Shanghai. They're going to stay in Bangalore. They're going to stay in Toronto. Toronto actually benefited largely last time President Trump was in power because tons of people who couldn't get into the US decided to go to Canada instead. So isn't President Trump hurting America by imposing this?
This is one of the questions that we are asking across all of his policy decisions, to which everybody needs to sort of sit at the edge of their seat and just see it play out. A lot of the science can be used to back up his decisions or against his decisions, but right now, there's a certain logic that's defying gravity in a sense. We're seeing a lot of the decisions that he has made were supposed to tank the economy, but we're seeing that it's at an all-time high. We're seeing that the debt that he was talking about, it's growing for sure, but that the tariffs are actually coming in. And there's cash in the bank there. And so it's sort of this really strange moment in which a lot of us are waiting in anticipation. Was he actually wrong or was he even right? And so even when it comes to the immigration debate, even when it comes to H-1Bs, I sense that, you know what, this will be a cash maker, even with the golden visa that he's offering for the $1 million to go straight through the process. And this is for high value candidates. My sense is that there's going to be more money in the bank for the United States because still, no matter what the price is, there are people waiting in line to enter the country. It is still the most prosperous economy. And so people want to get into that job market and invest into it.
And to be clear, most of these H-1B applications were coming from the tech sector. So now it's going to be Apple, Google, Microsoft, Adobe, all of them that are going to have to decide, you know what, maybe instead of applying for 10 people's H-1B at $100,000 a pop, let's just apply for one person's, get them the golden visa. They're guaranteed to go through. To which I ask, what type of salaries are these people even making? Because the ROI on $1 million investment or even $100,000, the ROI on that has to be significantly greater for a company to go through all of that. And that's not even including all the legal fees. I mean, if I was a lawyer in immigration services, I would definitely increase my rates. I know my clients can pay so much more. Why would I give them the same rate now?
I agree that there's going to be a complete market for this. It's just going to probably reorient and reshape and adapt to a whole new candidate base and a whole new set of companies. The companies that will be disserved by this decision are those that are not in that big trillion-dollar league for the big tech companies, but very likely those much smaller companies that were just applying for a single H-1, that had found a talented individual and now can't retain them, that had found opportunities to go to that next level, but they were still at that baseline when you compare it to those huge companies. I did want to change tack for a second because there's a question that was reeling through my mind, and this is a bit very different to the H-1B debate, but it's very much on immigration. And I keep thinking about climate, and I know there's climate deniers, so let's just put that part of the discussion on hold. But we are talking a lot about AI. And AI is becoming one of these big issues in terms of climate because the amount of energy that's required, the amount of compute that's required, that's actually going to start creating climate crises. So one of my concerns is whether it's AI or whether it's other technologies, we know that they are going to be contributing a great deal to other externalities that are possibly going to be creating different crises like immigration crises. And so I'm kind of curious when we start connecting these dots, how do you think this is going to land? Because it is also in part like colonies, they are to blame and as a result need to compensate for that. How do you see this kind of thing happening as we start to become more sophisticated in how we draw lines?
I don't see governments taking responsibility for displacing people as a result of AI impact on environment. I see them fully pinning that on the companies that are behind it. So OpenAI, Meta, Microsoft, any and all of them, really. For companies to take responsibility for it, what will they do? Cut a check? Maybe at best, after a court case is around for like 50, 60 years, maybe there will be a class action lawsuit where people get paid out some money. But at the end of the day, I don't actually see that changing anything for them, unfortunately, because there aren't countries that are necessarily putting their names on it. If it does happen, where let's say the US decides to open up AI infrastructure that fully depletes the resources of a developing nation, let's use the DRC as an example, I would be very surprised to see the US offer sanctuary to the residents that it impacts. But to your point, we've seen it done. We've seen France do it. We've seen the Netherlands do it. We haven't seen the UK do it. So there's two ways that you could really go on either side. Maybe it comes down to the administration that's in power, but given what I'm seeing in the US right now, I would be surprised if they chose to offer something so quote unquote generous. And I say quote unquote because this is after they have completely ruined someone's life and their home that they would be offering this.
So let's talk very briefly about geopolitics, right? So this is also a huge geopolitical discussion because immigration, of course, impacts markets and countries alike. And there's different ways of looking at this. There's one thing that I read, which I think you shared with me, which I thought was a very clear argumentation that for decades, the visas like the immigration visas or H-1Bs that were out there were a very successful ploy to vacuum up the talent that was there across the globe. But there's other aspects that I'm also quite interested in hearing your opinion on, especially when it comes to immigration. We're also talking about the financial repercussions on things like remittances. So a lot of the immigration that comes here actually is value that leaves the country and goes back to their home countries. And so there's a lot of these really challenging topics that I can now start seeing and start debating the different sides almost equally, actually.
The remittances are something that actually many nations have started to rely upon. Just in response to the H-1B news that came out this past week, Prime Minister Modi has already stated that this is going to be a way of disruption caused for families across his nation. So to think about the reliance of one nation on one visa program is insane. And it really comes down to what does this mean more broadly? The Trump administration did this with cause, but they also did this because they probably were aware of the geopolitical repercussions it would have. And so you look at the first Trump administration where Trump and Modi got along swimmingly. They were best friends. Then in the current administration, not so much. And maybe it's because of Modi's defiance to stop purchasing Russian oil or Trump's 50% tariff rate, to Modi recently shaking hands with Xi and Putin. So maybe this is just a tit for tat. And now President Trump is looking at immigration levers as ways of negotiating power. It's just another horse to trade.
It's a good point. And the challenge is that you have countries like China that are not bending the knee when it comes to any of the attempts that President Trump and the US administration are making. We see that all the sectors remain, relatively speaking, intact in India, in China, in Russia, or many of the other markets in which we're talking about for immigration. And that's also in part because a lot of people are waiting to see what's going to happen. And even the labor markets sort of pushed pause in terms of hiring because they weren't sure what's going to happen with the global economies, what is going to happen with different markets. And what we're seeing is that all of these big changes that are happening from an immigration perspective are also happening in this moment of relative calm. And when I say relative calm, I actually mean that, again, a lot of companies, A lot of organizations are just in this look and see moment. And I'm also kind of thinking a lot about from the technology side and innovation side, how much of these closed border initiatives are going to be anti innovation? Because that to me is a more strategic decision that governments would be making. And we know that there is a lot of talent that comes in from the outside and does feed into that innovation ecosystem in whatever country. And so when you do close those borders, what's going to happen?
Or what have you been seeing happen in the EU? The EU has been divided on this issue, I would argue, for longer than even the US has. And yes, I appreciate the EU as a bloc and different countries have different perspectives, but especially residing in Italy and also seeing things during your time in Germany, how are you seeing the response there? And is it that different from what we're seeing play out in the US?
I think the description as a block is the complicated factor. The vast number of people leaving their home countries and entering the EU are going to usually enter in through Italy. And one of the biggest challenges is that there is a really strange mechanism in which within the EU, each country that receives and accepts refugees will receive a payment. And however, that payment is typically not sufficient, not even for the duration in which they're detained and processed, but even for the additional cost that the system has to take. So the social security system, the insurance system that's in place in the country to be able to house and keep the refugees. And so there is a somewhat broken mechanism across the EU in which some countries take on a heavier burden of receiving refugees. And then, of course, the economies vary widely. You have the German economy, which these days is a bit weaker. But over the last 10 to 20 years, the German economy was very strong. And as a result, they were the ones taking the lead on a lot of the immigration topics. They were taking in over 1 million Syrian refugees. And the reason for it is because they had the strongest economy. But their borders were relatively speaking shielded because the vast majority of entrants were coming into Italy, into France, into Spain, Greece as well. These southern countries, which have poorer economies, they're struggling to keep their ends meeting.
So, in terms of how different it is from the US, it seems extremely different because in the EU, it's immigration. A lot of it seems like, fine, it might be happening legally, but a lot of it is also happening illegally. It's coming through those porous borders. They have not necessarily been invited into those countries in which they enter.
That's right. In fact, the way I keep thinking about it is what is the role of government? And typically, the role of government is first and foremost to safeguard and look for the prosperity of their own citizens and then residents. And so anybody who comes from the outside is typically not just seen as an alien. I'm using US language, but they're also seen as either you are contributing or you are taking. And from that stance, I can see why many governments are anti-immigration. Whereas I also understand from a humanitarian perspective, there is this desire to take in the people that need help because there are so many conflicts that are happening abroad. But then again, I'm always struggling with the argument that is being put out there by the far right that says we no longer want to deal with other countries' conflicts. We don't want to pay the price for it. It is not our problem. That in itself is a challenging topic because it costs money to take people in. And that balance of funds with usually poorer European nations, but we can talk about any nation, there isn't an infinite fund to be able to continue processing and retaining a lot of the refugees. And so for me, from an immigration standpoint, I sort of get into this blockage.
I wonder if immigration policy was originally viewed as a form of soft power. And maybe it still is. Maybe it's a good thing to be a country that has good immigration policies, that is welcoming and welcomes diversity. But in today's day and age, I can't even think of a single country that I would chalk that up to. Even Canada, a country that has prided itself on being very immigrant friendly, is now starting to impose more strict rules and regulations because, candidly, a lot of their rules and policies were not enforced appropriately and people manipulated them and took advantage of them. And now you look at things like wait times, road infrastructure, school enrollment rates, and it's great to welcome immigrants, but you have to also offer other resources in order to keep up with that demand. And now, if even Canada is feeling that pinch and starting to pull back, I can't imagine it being very pro-immigrant anywhere else in the world.
I'm also a benefactor, right? So I'm a Canadian citizen, and that's only because when I was 10 years old, my family moved to Canada. We did the residence, we did the point system, we became Canadian citizens. And I do understand what has happened since, because that Canada immigration policy that was around for decades, it really built the country to what it is today. It is a successful economy that is, of course, heavily reliant on the United States, but that's a geographic discussion as well. But now, as I've been hearing and discussing not just with you, but with many people, the situation in Canada is quite dire. And so I also am on that fence about what is the limit for immigration. And that, when you cannot answer that question, it sort of divides everybody to the polar opposites.
So, coming out of the current discussion, there's obviously going to be a difference in either the alliances or the relationships between nations. Before, countries could rely on one another, giving the example of India and the US again, to take a portion of their foreign workers and in turn get some money back. And that's just one example of many. We've also seen that happen with Mexico. We've seen that happen in the Philippines. And these are countries which are notoriously known for having a large foreign worker population and then getting that money back. But now that there's a rebalancing, I am wondering, who do you think the winners and the losers are going to be of these different immigration policies, but different, but very much all the same as we're seeing right off the top of the bat? I can see the losers in the short term being India, Mexico, and any other country that's been relying on getting their workers into other nations for money. And now that they are being forced to tackle it in the short term, that's really going to hurt. We might see a Silicon Valley pop up in Bangalore. We might see a Silicon Valley pop up in Shanghai. We're already starting to see certain Chinese citizens repatriate back to China. They'd spent their entire career, they had all of their education and everything done in the US. And now, having led a lot of the AI industry, they've decided to take their talents to China because they believe in the future of that country. So in the long term, I actually think this might benefit them.
I think that the winners are going to be categorically China, just because they have always been on the pathway of building innovation and innovative ecosystems, investing in not just technology, but across sectors. And so being able to bring that talent back, even the people that are feeling relatively safe within the United States are also opting to leave the country. Researchers are leaving the country. And so when you have a safe haven, and there is a budding ecosystem because it has been budding for a long time and people are really abuzz by it, I can see that they're going to win. I think that India is a more challenging discussion. And just because one of the things that's happening in India is that they have been more of an outsource hub. And I know that there's a huge innovation and startup ecosystem. There's a lot of VC money going in. But at the same time, one of the things that I have seen as a trend in India is that when a tech startup sort of starts to launch or take off in India, they go and establish a base in San Francisco, in the United States somewhere. And the reason for it is because in the end, there has been this separation between engineering talent and then the business chops that you also need, the marketing chops, the UX UI talent, and all of these other things that are very, very particular within the United States. And then across other nations, I'm actually wondering, do the countries that we're talking about that would be either winning or losing not just have the intention, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So beyond that, what is it that these countries are actually willing to do in order for them to build and take advantage of this moment in which they are able to repatriate talent or even bring in new talent from different nations? And I'm not seeing too much of that. Even the UK, which has an upper hand just because they've had a lot of investments over decades, and even now huge investments coming from the US, I'm just not seeing that they are ready to become a hub. There's another thing that I've started noticing as well, and we were talking about protests very recently. There's a lot of protests happening in the UK, in Italy, in Netherlands, and a lot of this is anti-immigration resentment. And we're starting to see even Elon Musk getting involved in European politics. He's a big supporter of AfD in Germany. He also speaks a lot about Italy, but then recently he was attending Tommy Robinson's rally in the UK, really talking a lot about these types of far-right beliefs, closing the borders and immigration status, etc.
We've seen governments be pro-immigrant and not so pro-immigrant. Very rare are those countries that are consistent. And that's why I keep coming back to Canada as an example. Regardless of whether you voted for the Liberals or the Conservatives, everyone was always very pro-immigrant or immigration until recently. And that's something that I'm saying, like, if that's happening in Canada, that's happening everywhere. And it must be happening at least 1,000 times worse. But I wonder, how far is too far? Once you've stepped back, can you ever step forward? And as terrible as it sounds, there is always going to be conflict in this world. People are always going to be looking for better opportunity. And once a country that has closed its doors has seen the repercussions of it internally, and it starts seeing its resources being depleted because there isn't anyone there to fill in those gaps, be it farm laborers to really intelligent AI specialists. They're going to feel the squeeze. And as soon as those doors open back up, people will flood back in.
Let's switch over to ethics because I have a contentious question for you here. I was recently watching Jimmy Kimmel, who just came back online after being suspended, and I was just very briefly watching his monologue in the beginning. A lot of times, what he kept saying is that some of the things that have happened against freedom of speech were un American. And one of the things that I keep thinking about here is that there is also this sort of tone deafness between one side and the other. And I think that what Jimmy Kimmel has gotten wrong is that he is not accounting for the people that have voted for Donald Trump and do support his view, Donald Trump's view of freedom of speech. And as a result, I sense as though we're just shouting into echo chambers. And so when I talk about this, when it relates to immigration, I'm also still curious when different countries, they say this is not American, this is not Italian, this is not British, but actually there's different sides to the same nation. And this is the part where I'm struggling a little bit to be able to say, well, actually, this is just the other side of the same coin.
That's a very good way of looking at it. These people have always lived here. They've always had those opinions. They're as American, as Italian, as Canadian as you and I are. And now they are just voicing those thoughts that they probably kept quiet because they felt like it wasn't culturally appropriate or socially appropriate. What does it mean to have an American value anyway? I feel like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like the Constitution, is being redefined daily. What is the First Amendment right? What is everything else? Because everyone's interpretation of what we probably took for granted is now proving to be quite different.
I like how you're actually taking this down to the detail because I think that is how we're going to answer this question. We're not going to agree on values, so let's get to some of the technical detail and agree on some of the finer points. Because this is the challenge is that when I take this to the court of law, I'm also seeing the Supreme Court that allows ICE agents to start targeting based on race and language. And this is a values-based discussion that is now getting ingrained into the law. And this also makes me challenged with the idea of how is it that any country, it doesn't matter whether it's the United States, whether it's Canada, whether it's UK, Italy, Germany, or any of the other countries in the world, how do they view diversity? Do they want diversity for what it actually means and entails? Or is that actually a term that is only going to belong in the past? And of course, I don't like to be absolutist, but that to me is one of the things that I also see as a challenge when it comes to bridging gaps.
Especially as we see more and more people, especially younger people, reverting back to traditional values in terms of expecting certain traditional perspectives of what a man and woman's role is in society, what they expect of their partners. And that's a whole separate issue, but we're seeing this come forward in relationships as well. And I wonder if we swung too far on the pendulum towards diversity and inclusion, that now we're swinging back. Maybe it wasn't a good direction to go in. I can't imagine it. Again, this is going against every grain and every fiber of my being to even say this, but there are certain countries that pride themselves on being very monolithic and not having diversity. And that is what it means, for example, to be Japanese. That is what it means to have those values. And they actually pride themselves on making it difficult for people to immigrate and assimilate into their culture. I just never thought the world would agree that that is the direction we should go into. Slightly shifting gears, but looking at the whole visa situation, immigration situation, we mentioned refugees, we mentioned work visas. And in a world where now it's getting harder and harder to immigrate regardless of your visa status, do you think it's ethical for countries to prioritize high-skilled visas over humanitarian entry?
Oh, that's a tough one. I do think that this is challenging for the most part because I do believe to one of the things that I was saying earlier, the government is first and foremost responsible for its existing citizens before they look at global citizens. And that challenge to me does really get spliced with this exact question, because in the end, it is in the country's interest to grow its bank balance and its economy in such a way that they can do charitable work. But they can't only do charitable work or give preference to charitable work because we all know that all the charities in the world, from the United Nations to the NGOs, rely on the benevolence of economies and companies that have done well. And as a result, that mathematics is kind of the same logic that I bring to this argument, in which a country with a healthy bank balance and a healthy economy that is growing is able to do the refugee work. But one that isn't is the one that will continue to struggle. And so I do believe that they should give preferential treatment to the talent-based visas over the refugee-based visas?
See, it's tricky because I said ethically, and I feel like ethically, I think, yes, give it to those people who are in war zones and need to get out of there, and they might not be able to provide much value to your country, but it's okay because you're still saving a human life. And from an ethical perspective, I need to remind myself that ethics is not equivalent to rose-colored glasses. It's still also practical and realistic. And at that point, you have to also prioritize your country's interests, as you were saying. Otherwise, that's what leaves a bad taste in every citizen's mouth when they see people coming in. But when they see people coming in using their resources and not contributing value to the local economy, that's when people, local citizens, start feeling slighted. And that's how the anti-immigrant sentiment begins.
And you know, there's a very important nuance to what you were saying that is constantly disregarded, and that is integration. One of the biggest and underfunded activities when you do bring in immigrants of whatever status is how much does a country actually invest in integrating them into the country. And in fact, this is the biggest issue that we have typically seen in many countries, and as a result, driving this sort of divide that we are starting to see. From an ethical perspective, and we've said this in the past, you first serve the citizens of your own country before you serve those of others, because you can't do it the other way around. But I would also say that there's the gray area in which you don't do only one, wait to see success, and then do the other. And so this is where there should be a balance of being able to support the humanitarian cause and the refugee cause. But at the same time, this is the place in which you just need to find this relative balance that a country can afford, in which internally they're at peace with being able to support. And I know that what I've just said is probably going to get me hated from a lot of my colleagues and peers in the United Nations and whatnot. But I think that the topic of finances is something that even the United Nations is struggling with right now. And that's in large part because the mechanism that has been fueling the organizations of charity is now starting to break down. The value system is changing. And so these are all really important parameters. I have one last question for you. We know that everybody's on polar opposites when it comes to this debate on immigration. What do you think it's going to take for people to sort of back up from the cliff that we're walking towards and just sort of meet somewhere in the middle?
If I get this right, do I get to become president of any nation? Because I feel like this is a pretty contentious question. What do I think it'll take for the world to walk back from the cliff and view immigration in a different light? And not be so divided, because it seems like you mean this on both sides, not just the people who are very anti-immigration, but also pro-immigration. To walk back, it would require both sides to talk to each other. And I feel like that's the hardest thing to ask. It would come down to both sides understanding why they see immigration as being a force for good or a force for bad. And then not only recognizing that the other side probably, in fact, definitely has valid points, but how you can come to a medium which makes sense. I don't know what that medium is, so I'll tap out on that one. But we cannot come to a solution before people talk about it. Otherwise, one side is going to be so angry. They're going to feel like a solution was pushed down their throats, and they will not comply. They will be unhappy. People need to be heard. They have valid concerns, and those need to be taken into account. Immigration has always been about movement. Of people, of ideas, of futures. The question now is whether we build walls that stop the flow or channels that guide it towards shared prosperity. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the episode. New episodes drop every Tuesday. See you next week.